Welcome to On the Soul's Terms podcast, a weaving of astrology, Greek mythology, and depth psychology. I'm Chris Skidmore, an astrologer, psychotherapist, and craniosacral therapist living in Ubud, Bali. Do you ever feel like your mind is running the show? Like, no matter what you do, it just won't stop thinking, planning, worrying. Today we're exploring the idea of losing one's head, not just in frustration, but as a mythic and symbolic act. Across fairy tales and myths, we find characters who literally lose their heads. Clever Elsie, the Argus, Medusa, Orpheus, and in each case, something profound is revealed when the mind gets out of the way. Why does Pisces season invite us into this surrender? And what happens when we stop gripping onto certainty and let go? Let's dive in. Pisces is the final sign of the zodiac, the place where structure dissolves and we're invited into something deeper. In myths and fairy tales, this often appears as a dramatic symbol, the severed head. What does it mean to lose one's head, and what wisdom might emerge when the mind finally gets out of the way? Today's fairy tale is Clever Elsie, a bizarre Grimm's fairy tale I stumbled upon while reading with a friend. And when I say bizarre, I mean truly unhinged. Clever Elsie, as her name suggests, is very clever. Her parents decide it's time for her to marry, so they arrange for a man named Hans to come and meet her. So Hans comes over for dinner and everybody's getting together and having a good time and enjoying themselves. And the father asks Elsie if she'll just go down and get a pitcher of beer from down in the cellar. Elsie is more than happy to do so. So she goes and gets the pitcher. She taps it along and sings a little song, making sure her mind is always busy. So she doesn't really have any moments when she's not thinking because she is very clever. And so she walks down into the basement. And so that's an interesting direction, isn't it? When we walk down into the basement, we can sort of feel that we might be entertaining some deeper, darker thoughts down there, ones that are maybe more in the unconscious that have been lurking around. Anyway, she walks down there, and as she's just about to open the tap of the keg, she sees a pickaxe left in the cellar, and because she's clever, her mind spirals. If she marries Hans and they have a son, and one day that son comes back to get a beer, that pickaxe will most certainly fall and kill him. And just like that, Elsie is weeping for her hypothetical dead son who does not exist. So Elsie's been gone a long time up at the dinner, and the father sends down the servant to find out what's actually been going on down there. The servant finds Elsie wailing. Elsie explains the death of the hypothetical son, and the servant, moved by her genius, joins in. Then the mother, then the father, then the whole family. Within minutes, they're all on the floor in absolute despair, mourning a child who was never born. At this point, you might be thinking, Elsie, take a breath. Maybe have a sip of that beer. But no, she's fully committed to this catastrophe, and the only logical response is to collapse in despair. Meanwhile, Hans is up the top and he's just alone up there. The whole family is gone, and they'll be gone a long time. Everybody that goes down there doesn't seem to return. So he decides to walk downstairs and into the basement to see what's going on. So Hans, he walks in, surveys the wreckage of this family in a mourning crisis, and inexplicably decides Elsie is the wife for him, because apparently cleverness is what he was looking for. And here's where the story plays with something interesting, the difference between being clever and being wise. That's part one of the story of Clever Elsie. The rest doesn't make much sense, so I'll spare you, but here's what happens. There is no boy, no child. Instead, Elsie thinks herself out of existence. She asks a single fateful question. Is it I, or is it not I? And in that moment, She spirals into existential angst, unable to answer, and simply disappears. The first part of the story is classic overthinking, the intellect's spinning itself into a paranoid spiral, convinced of a reality that isn't real. This is the shadow side of Aquarius, building intricate mental frameworks that ultimately collapse. Think a beautiful mind, the genius who sees patterns everywhere until they consume him. But the second part, that's pure Pisces. She stops grasping at reality and simply dissolves. Elsie doesn't just overthink, she thinks herself out of existence. So that's Elsie, and really Elsie is a character who does most definitely require her head to be taken off. So let's have a look then as we leave Elsie behind and thank her for the absurd lessons that she teaches us about the dangers of our minds. And we'll wander off from Elsie into the mythic world. And it's a story that I've told before on the podcast, but it's kind of like the spiraling galaxy. When we go round and round, we can learn new things about those things that we've heard, especially when it comes to mythology. And a big part of learning mythology is actually repetition, just going back over and over again. So in this one, it's the story of Io. Io is a maiden. She catches the attention of Zeus, and we all know where that's probably going to end up. Zeus, in order to disguise this love affair that he's having with Io, creates a lot of cloud coverage. But then Hera is up on Mount Olympus and she looks down and she sees a particularly strange weather pattern happening, and so she rushes down there. There's Zeus and he hears her coming, so he does what I guess any man would do in that situation, and that's turn the woman into a cow. I guess this was the solution that he came up with in the moment, but it was probably not the best solution given that cows are sacred to Hera, and Hera picks up on that straight away. So she looks at Zeus and she looks at the cow and she says, well, that's a really beautiful cow that you have there. Will you give her to me? And of course then Zeus is in a very difficult situation. He's either going to have to admit that this isn't actually a cow, or he's just going to have to keep going with the ruse and give her over. He gives the cow over to Hera, and Hera puts her behind the Argus. The Argus is the 100-eyed monster. He has some eyes that are awake and some eyes that are asleep. So he's like this figure of hyper-vigilance, especially with these 360-degree eyes. Psychologically, it's good to have some level of vigilance. I mean, we wouldn't be alive if we didn't have vigilance. Think about the story of the dodo birds there. So it's something essential about the human being to have a certain level of vigilance so that we are awake and we are aware. But the condition of hypervigilance is when that awareness has gone into a overdrive state. So Zeus now feels bad, of course, to save Io. He's going to send Hermes, and Hermes is tasked with the role of taking off his head, which is to say that we leave the mind behind and come back into either the somatics of the body or the feeling center or something underneath that big mega computer upstairs. Hypervigilance isn't just about being aware. It's about never being able to switch off. It's that constant scanning, overanalyzing, always watching for danger. And here's the kicker. When we're in that state, we think we're keeping ourselves safe, but really, we're just exhausting ourselves. That's why Hermes, the trickster, doesn't fight Argus. He lulls him into sleep. And that sleep, that surrender, is actually the thing that sets him free. He disguises himself as a goat herder, and he has his panpipes with him. He's just wandering along, whistling a tune, playing a little song, telling a few stories in musical form. And the Argus, who's been at it for a long time already, standing in front of Io, making sure he's doing his work diligently, making sure he sees everything and everyone. He calls Hermes over and asks him to play him a song and tell him a story. Hermes, of course, he invented music in the first place, so you can imagine he's got 1,000,001 songs and stories. But this time he's trying to think of the most boring story in existence. He's trying to tell a story so boring that it's going to put the Argus to sleep. But every time he gets to something in the story that's a little bit exciting, all of these eyes pop open again. So they're like getting drowsy, and then they pop open again. And he can't help it because he's Hermes, he's a storyteller. So his story is always a bit enticing and a bit suspenseful. But then eventually he tells the story of Pan. And for some reason, this story of Pan, who's chasing Syrinx, in order to get away from Pan, she turns herself into these reeds. And then Pan, when he sees these reeds, gathers up the reeds, and that becomes a musical instrument. That becomes the panpipes, which of course Hermes also has at that time. So he tells this very circular situation where he's got the pipes, he's got the panpipes, and he tells the story of the panpipes. And I'm sure as he's telling the story, he's playing very melodious lullabies into the panpipes to illustrate the story. That's enough for the Argus. It's like all 100 eyes finally fall asleep. And then, well, this won't help his hyper-vigilance very much, but this is what happens to the Argus, is that his head is taken off by Hermes, of course. He's cured of his condition in a way. He's out of his mind. In fact, Hermes, or Mercury, is forever after known as the Argus Slayer, because no other god could have possibly gotten close enough to the Argus to affect that kind of a change. Of course, Hera was so devastated at the loss of the Argus, obviously she felt kind of responsible for that, that she made those 100 eyes the peacock feathers. And in fact, Hera's chariot is drawn by peacocks. Argus does end up immortalized through the peacock. So let's move into the next story, the next myth about the head. And of course, this is Medusa. Now, I covered Medusa's story in the Scorpio episode, and so I won't go into the whole thing. If you do want to hear a deeper dive into Medusa and her mythology, you can go back to that episode. In this story, she also is in a state of headiness in that she's been frozen in time. But it's not the same as clever Elsie, who's so clever that she thinks herself into all of these dilemmas that were never going to happen. And she's not the same as the Argus, who's a symbol of that hyper-vigilance and insomnia, where the mind just can't let go of something. No, Medusa's been through a trauma. In that traumatic state, she's just stuck. She's completely out of her body, and she's in a frozen sort of a state. And there's this entangled snake hair. She's terrified, and she's terrifying. The effect of looking into Medusa's eyes is to freeze. So if we think about that as a dream, it's like this part of you that's frozen can also freeze other parts, just like Elsie, who was in a paranoid state. She could also make other parts of herself paranoid. It's the same with Medusa here. The only solution for this kind of situation is, again, off with your head. It's very instructive, actually, the tools that Perseus brings along with him in order to take the head off. The first tool are the winged sandals of Hermes, and it's very instructive that he doesn't get the winged helmet because, of course, Hermes also has a winged helmet, but that wouldn't be suitable for this task because this is the sort of task that is going to require the feet rather than the head. And remember that the feet are ruled by Pisces, helping us to remember that we can think with our feet, which means that we can think as far away from the brain as possible. And I really do feel this, and it's worthy of an experiment if you're game for it, is to just have a feel into where do you actually think from? And is it possible to think from many different areas of the body? In Perseus's case, he was asked to think from his feet in a way, or stay swift on his toes. So it was important to keep moving and to not get stuck anywhere because, of course, the condition that Medusa is in is a real sense of stuckness. The second tool given to Perseus is Hades' helmet of invisibility. There's this sense of bringing something from the underworld. The underworld, of course, is the place of soul, and especially the place of rebirth and transformation. So having this with him is just helping him to be aware that the underworld is not the end, and Medusa's story is not at an end. So I feel like having this helmet of invisibility is very useful for him to be able to move around. It also gives him the possibility to kind of like glide into that cave where Medusa is, if necessary, and find his way through. And of course, the third and final thing that Athena gives to Perseus is the mirror shield. Ultimately, this is like the Libran element, and this gives Perseus the ability to reflect. And if he wasn't able to reflect, then he wouldn't be able to really be of any use when it comes to Medusa. Because in a sense, the whole Medusa story is like there's a frozen Medusa and there's also a frozen relational field. And so he needs to know how to be relational again, which means that when he looks at Medusa, he can't look straight at her or he'll freeze. But if he looks through the mirror, then he's able to see her. While looking into that mirror, he actually sees himself. So this is his ability to see the monster in the mirror. And only then is he able to take off her head. And here's something fascinating. Medusa's head isn't just a symbol of death. In fact, it becomes a source of healing. Her blood is given to Asclepius, the god of medicine, one side poisonous, the other capable of resurrection, which tells us something profound. What we cut off, what we fear, what we exile often contains the very medicine we need. The monster we refuse to face might be holding the cure. Now, the beauty of this story is that what happens when Medusa's head is gone is that the Pegasus is born. So the Pegasus is a symbol of 4 feet that can be on the ground, but also winged so he can be free. So this symbol of freedom, this symbol of liberation comes out. And of course, there's also the Chrysaor who has a flaming sword, this empowered center, almost like that fire that goes up and down the spine, is available again. And the story moves on. Just to recap, we had clever Elsie thinks her way into absolute paranoid madness. Then next after her, we had the Argus, a symbol of hyper-vigilance and being forever awake or insomnia. And then we had the frozenness of Medusa, who's gone through a certain trauma, and she's in a freeze state. And those she sees also go into freeze. So the final of these stories is Orpheus. I did an episode on Orpheus, but I kind of stopped halfway, really. And I stopped at the point where Orpheus had gone down into the underworld and returned with Eurydice. But just as he crossed the threshold, he looked back and she was gone, and she gives the farewell. Well, what happens next in Orpheus's story is he takes out his instrument, the lyre, and he starts playing songs on it. And they're all really sad love songs. They're just all tragic love songs. So one after the other, he tells these stories of love and loss, until eventually the Maenads, who are the followers of Dionysus, they couldn't take it anymore. And of course, Dionysian consciousness is about reveling and enjoying and being in the sensual, in the pleasure field of life. And whilst there was a certain amount of pleasure that could be derived from these sad songs, eventually it was just too many. It was a bummer. It was a real bummer. And it was getting in the way of them having a good time and enjoying themselves. And they tore him apart, limb from limb. You gotta love the gruesomeness of some of these stories. In some ways, then, we see the condition that Orpheus goes into of being dismembered, which, as we know, is the opposite of being remembered, or remembering and dismembering. So now he's dismembered. He's in a completely fragmented state. And I think it's a good, suitable image to go with, because he's been with the kind of loss that he just is unable to really be with. He's not really able to move through the phases of grief. He's not really able to move the story forward. He's only able to just be stuck in this sorrowful place. I think there's a difference here of entering sorrow, going down, like a Nana goes down into the underworld, or Persephone as well is down in the underworld, but there's always some kind of return. And I think the difference for Orpheus is there was just no sense of return. Once he'd lost his love, that was it for him. And he just couldn't really return to life. And so the Maenads came along and pretty much sent him back to death in a way. Now, the beautiful image there is that you see Orpheus's head next to his musical instrument, the lyre, and the two of them are drifting down the stream back to the river Styx. And he's still singing, his head is still singing, drifting along. So what does it mean that Orpheus's head keeps singing? Maybe it's telling us that something remains even after loss, some echo, some lingering presence that refuses to die. His love story ended, but his voice carried on. Is it a tragic symbol, or is it proof that something of the soul, something of the music always survives? Almost like our nodal story right now, right? We don't want to move away from Virgo to get to Pisces, and we don't want to lose Pisces to get to Virgo. Virgo is the analytical mind, and Pisces is the soulful exploration. And we really want those two working together. And that, to me, feels like the image as they float down the head and the lyre, floating down back to the underworld. And of course, for once, there actually is a happy ending here, because once he gets to the underworld, he's remembered back into his form, and then he connects again with Eurydice, and they are united in the underworld. So where does this leave us? We started with clever Elsie, the mind spiraling itself into absurdity. We moved through Argus, the hyper-vigilant overthinker who finally had to let go. We saw Medusa, frozen in trauma, whose severed head held the power of transformation. And finally Orpheus, whose inability to trust cost him everything, until in the end, even his dismembered head found its way back to the underworld, reunited with what was lost. Each of these stories speaks to the limits of the mind, what happens when we grip too tightly, when we try to think our way out of emotional, instinctive, or soul-level experiences. But mythology reminds us the answer is never in the head. So maybe this is an invitation to lose your head just a little, to let go of the relentless thinking, the need to control, the endless analyzing, to trust the undercurrents of life, even when they don't make sense. Because sometimes the wisdom we're looking for doesn't come from the mind. It comes from what happens when we finally stop trying to think our way through it. Next time, we'll be diving into medical astrology with Kira Sutherland, who I just met recently on the Gold Coast at the Federation of Australian Astrologers Conference. If this episode got you thinking, hopefully not too much, you won't want to miss this next one. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.